told that brick is, or the manufacture of brick is the oldest known manufactured building material, and this goes back to 4000 BC. And I think we've all seen a lot of antiquities made of a variety of brick in Rome and Greece, and of course from the Bible we know that the Hebrews were busy making brick for the Egyptians and not liking it very well. Brick has a problem in that it weighs quite a bit, and therefore usually it is made fairly close to where it's going to be used because it's too expensive to move around. And it's usually where they find some sort of material that is adaptable for that, some sort of clay or shale. Sometimes they've ground it up, I guess. And so this sort of determines where a brickyard might or might not occur too. You're familiar with the schematic here of Astalon, and there's some reports going way back to 1837 or 1842, write-ups by people who investigated, who felt that our Indian ancestors here actually were making brick because they found baked shards of it. I think this has been possibly discredited recently with the feeling that some of this was just chinking in their log fortifications, that when it got burnt down it became baked as you would have a brick made. But of course with brick you have to have first a mold, and once it's been molded then the brick has to be dried, and finally it has to be fired so it has some durability to it. And this technique hasn't really changed a lot over the years. Well, when we start talking about brickyards around here, first of all, brickyards started appearing in the colonies in the early 1600s, so some technique of that was known. One of the other things related to people starting a brickyard is you have to have some masons around who know how to do something with it. And of course, this held up things in the early settlement days of Jefferson County. Now, as you can see, this is a map of Astalon, and I'm not really too sure how some of the things which have been presented as historical data about it. For instance, they have talked about Frost and Starkweather as being the first ones who made brick in the area. And I don't know where they made it. The only thing I could find about them, first of all, I couldn't find that name Frost anywhere, and I don't know if it possibly should have been Frost instead. However, there was a Starkweather, Asa Starkweather, and he did buy some land along the river in Watertown, and very possibly this is where they had their brickyard. But the only information I've ever seen is just that they made the first brick. Also, some of these sources, most of it seems to come from that DAR booklet of 1911, and I don't know who really compiled that. But they also said that Kelly Atwood and Ambrose Foster made the first pressed brick. Well, I have no idea where they did that. I would presume it would have been in the Lake Mills area. Again, there had to be a source of clay that was amenable to being made into brick. And I think that this very possibly was down around Water Street, because that's where the later brickyards did appear. Anyway, there was a brickyard, the first one I've identified on paper at least, near Fort Atkinson in 1847, and this was Milo Jones and a friend of his, and actually their brickyard was where the current Horde Dairy Farm is right now, up on the hill there, so that must have been where they found a supply of clay. And also know that there's a statement that in 1845, there were no brick houses in Watertown. So that suggests there certainly were no brick makers there. And Lake Mills had some early brick buildings which occurred, I would say, probably between 1845 and 1847. Supposedly that first schoolhouse that was built where the Masonic Lodge is now was of brick. Now, I don't know where they would have gotten the brick. I'm almost certain they wouldn't have brought it all the way out from Milwaukee, not in those early days where it was hard enough to get here on any circumstance. And there may have been a brickyard. Maybe this Frost and Starkweather brickyard existed. I had this little schematic here because it's listed in the Wisconsin Gazetteer that the Astlin had a brickyard in 1853. And this had been right here. Here's the road as it still is, the bridge. And it was described as being on the east side of the river and north of the road. I've not been able to find out who possibly owned the land at that time, so it's somewhat a mystery. Someone later sent a little article to the Leader, I think in the 1890s or something, and pointed out that this brickyard had supplied brick for our museum church and also for at least 3 other brick houses in the area. So these were probably some of the first ones. This is just another schematic showing the plat for Astlin, and this is somewhat later appearing plat. This, I think, is probably from the 1890s, but it does not show any brickyards, unfortunately. As I say, you have to have a supply of clay, and when they would dig around and find one, this is what would change their mind. And this is a recent excavation out just north of town, and you see that's probably some pretty good clay, actually. It was said that Enoch Fargo on one of his farms found a very fine quality of white clay. Apparently, as far as I know, he never did anything with it. Jefferson had the first brickyards I've been able to identify there was one in 1869, which was about a mile, described as a mile south of the courthouse, and in 1872 a second brickyard appeared. John Perner and a couple others who had a brickyard somewhere along North Main Street in Jefferson. Well, what do we know about Lake Mills? Well, here's the church, and with the brick, which you now know goes back at least to 1853, 1855, when they did have this brickyard, and again, I don't know who ran it. The first brick house supposedly built in Lake Mills, and probably a lot of you have seen this before. This was that of William Bragg's, and he built this about 1847 or 1848. Pardon me. And this site is where the library is currently. They tore it down in order to make room for the library. Now, about that time, it could have been some brick that Ambrose Foster and Kelly Atwood had made, but however, Philander Everson also was stated to have had a brickyard at one time, and a Truman Hoyt worked with him. This was in the 1845, 1848 era, and at that time Philander Everson had land on East Lake Street where the old funeral home is, and also land on Water Street, so very conceivably this is where his brickyard was. It was never pointed out as such. Now, the Harbecks were the first stonemasons who appeared, and they appeared about 1847, 1848, and this is when people started getting interested in having buildings of brick. Caspar Steinfort, who had bought some land up on North Main Street, found some nice red clay and began making red brick out of it, and this land is where Pearl Balaam's house is now. Pearl has been told that the land they have is where the brickyard was, and this certainly was land owned by Caspar Steinfort. The interesting thing is that this building, with which we're familiar on Lake and Main Street, was built in 1866 and is of red brick, which I have some here. Pass around, if you will. And it's not a too good quality brick, because that's why they've had to remove some of it and replace it with other. But I have a strong feeling, just because of the sequence of dates, that this came from Steinfort's brickyard. Then about 1867, B.B. Sanborn, who you've heard about because he was the one who had the hotel and furniture business and everything else in Lake Mills, and who had a book written about him, bought land on the south side of Water Street from the Colts and proceeded to build brick. Now, we don't know where any of his brick went, again, because most of it would be used within a close distance. We'd have to feel that since he was making this for a number of years, that someone was using it. Now, this is a little later, but you can see Green's Cream Brickworks. About 1870, Sanborn sold his brickyard to a Herman Raybaum. And if you look out at in the schoolhouse out at Astlin, there's this big plat map, and on the edge you can see Herman Raybaum's ad for his brickyard. Well, he ran this brickyard till about, I think it was about 1877, and then he sold it to a William Daring. And Daring then started making brick in this yard, and another brick which very possibly came from this era is this one really rather crude handmade brick which came from the old schoolhouse, the old high school, which was also a primary building and has been torn down quite a few years. But you see, it's a rather large, clumsy brick. The school was built about 1867, so this could have been one that came from Sanborn's brickyard, actually. Well, Daring kept this, bought some more land from Mary Lewis along the south side of Water Street, but then in 1881 he sold it to a Myron Green from Lowell. Green probably was one of the more ambitious of the brickyard manufacturers. He bought a lot more land. He bought 4 brick-making machines. He put a lot of water piping in and a windmill, and he was selling brick all over the place. Now, at that time, of course, the railroad had come through, so he sent 4 carloads of brick up to Juneau, where they built their poorhouse. He sent brick to Jefferson Junction for some of their buildings, and he sold an awful lot of it in Madison. That very first year, he was making 15,000 brick a day. Now, obviously, he wasn't doing it all alone. He had several helpers. One interesting sidelight of all this is he had erected a bell on the property, and they used to ring the bell to call the workers for time to come to work. And at that time, it was said that he was selling all the brick he could make in Madison. So that was a very good source for him. And by November of 1881, he had made over 800,000 brick. So he was being really productive. And he also had contacts with contractors from Minnesota, and the next few years he was sending a lot of brick to Minnesota. Now, where it went, I have no idea. But even in 1886 and 1887, this was happening. Well, During was sort of a straw boss for him, and you know, this was seasonal occupation, really. They never made any brick in the wintertime for various obvious reasons, and so it was part-time employment, and this William Doering was sort of the straw boss for Green, although he had left about 1887 and started a meat market on East Lake Street. However, I think it was in 1888 that Myron Green sold this back to Doering, and Doering brought in a relative of his, Charles Krause, who is a relative of Donna Keyes. Got a different Keyes here. And they still live in the house where, which was the Krause house, and which was on the edge of Green's brickworks. As you can see, this extends along where the Rock Lake apartments are, and the what's called Cider Street there is now runs along the side of Century. So this gives you a little perspective. And of course, this area gets down toward the Rock Creek, and I suppose this is where they found a great deal of their clay. And this is the Keyes house, and Keyes house, sorry. And this is a brick that they dug up out of their garden, so I'm very sure that it was coming from either the Green or the Doering brickyard. It's a little better quality of brick, a little better shaped, so, you know, they were getting a little more sophisticated. But Donna was very kind to present me with one of those. I guess this Charles Krause was a brother-in-law of Doering, and the little brick house next to it I have a feeling was Doering's, although he built a house near the brickyard and I haven't been able to really zero in on it. The area just east of that was called the schoolhouse lot, which was donated for a school or set apart for a school, but then they never built a school there. And this is a picture of that brick which is going around. It's a little better formed, it's a little more durable. Well, the brickyard closed in 1891 in spite of the protests of the leader and never reopened, so that was the end of that. In 1898, Doering sold his house, and a year later he sold quite a bit of this land to a William Volkman. I think that probably was the rest of the brick land. Well, there isn't that much more to talk about brickyards, but I thought I would use a few comparison things here. Now this is the Yandry house on North Main. It was built originally by Mr. Saltz about 1853, so this would have been about the time of the Astlin brickyard, and this brick could very well have come from there. And the Robert Fargo first home was also built about that same time, which would also make it very possible he got the brick from there. Certainly it would have come, I would think, from somewhere in the county. And there were no brickyards in Jefferson at that time, so only other place I can think of would be either Fort Atkinson or Watertown, and I don't know too much about brickyards in Watertown. This is what I always call the Frank Marsh home. It was built by Chapin in 1855-56, and it's on Washington Street. It's still pretty much the same one. This, of course, was taken in the early 1900s, but this would again been brick that was brought possibly from the Astlin Brickyard. And then the Griswold house, which is at the pretty much on the corner of Washington and Mulberry Street, also built in 1855. And then the old Moravian church parsonage and whatever all it had on the top of Fremont Street Hill, and the building which is still there, was built in 1858. Again, there's, I would think, a strong suspicion that this is brick that could have been brought from the Astlin area. And then William Foster built this nice little brick house on Franklin Street in 1864, and this would have been before the time of Sanborn. It raises the question of whether possibly some of this would have been from Foster, from Ambrose Foster, who was a son of William Foster. And again, I don't know when they were making this brick, because nobody has ever identified this. Again, this is a pretty nice brick house. And then the old school, which is of course now long gone, built in 1867. And from the crudeness of the brick, I think this could very well have been from the Sanborn Brickyard. Obviously, he was selling brick somewhere, or he wouldn't have been in business for several years. And this is, of course, that brick that I'm passing around. This is Levi Leonard. The house is now that of Larry Radel. That was built in 1867, 1868. And again, possibly brick from the Sanborn Brickyard. And Robert Fargo's second house, which was built about 1869, certainly could also have been from that same brickyard. And also at that time was the George Bishop house, which is now Randy Otto's. And again, there could be assumption of it coming from the Sanborn Brickyard. This house was built by John Tummy in 1877. Thank you. Which would have been the next era, and sort of in between Herman Raybaum and Doering. Very likely it would have come from the brick made by Doering at that time. And this is the Doering house. So obviously he used his own brick. And on the corner of Washington and Mulberry is a house built originally about 1879 by Hans Anderson, and who then sold it to his father-in-law, Lorenzo Fargo. And so this would be brick that would be from the Doering era. And the first depot, unfortunately isn't in too good a focus, which was built in 1881, would still have been from the Doering Brickyard. And Royal Hassam's building on East Lake Street was built in 1881. So again, Hassam was also a carpenter, and I would think he would have used local brick. And this house is David Cole's house, built in 1882. And again, I would have making the assumption that Doering would have provided brick for that. Now this house isn't there any longer, and this is just a drawing of it. It was built by C.C. Smith, who was who ran the mill, and he built this right above the mill It's where the Sinclair station is now. They took down the whole hill, unfortunately. But he built this in 1882, so this would have been the Myron Green era. And I would feel that this is brick from there, although Smith was originally from the Watertown, Ixonia area, so he may have had contacts there. I don't know. And this is the Redigue house, Alan Redigue's house. It was built in 1882 by W.W. Ingram as sort of a rental thing, but eventually in the 1890s he sold it to the Redigues. And I would make an assumption that this came from the Myron Green Brickyard. Now in 1885, there was a W.D. Millard who had been involved in a variety of things in town, and he built this house on the left, which you still see, and I would think this would be Green's Brickyard also. About that time, a lot of wooden buildings downtown were getting a brick veneer. Among them was a Charles Hoseley, who had a building on West Lake Street just behind the Fargo Mercantile, and he brick veneered his building, and about 5 years later Frank Foote bricked up his wooden building. That's the building right next to the little small shop there, which is now the dentist's office. So that brick goes back to that, again, the Green era. This house was built by another miller, Mr. Douglas. It was built in 1890 and would probably have been in the Daring and Krause era. And very probably it came from that, as well as the Neipert blacksmith shop. I looked diligently. Lots of times in the leader they would write up a description of a new building, but unfortunately they didn't give me any particulars about that, except that Royal Hassom built it, so I would assume he was using local brick. I put a little arrow down there. That's where the old original brick schoolhouse was, which some date back to 1845. And the reason I put it in right here is because the Evangelical Church took that over and enlarged and expanded it over a period of years, but in 1891 they decided to build a whole new church, and so they sold all their brick and was bought by Dr. Earl, who put it into building this house. So some of that old brick is somewhere in that house. I don't know where. Well, the first depot burnt down, and in 1892 they built a second one, and very definitely we know this brick came from the Jefferson Brickyard, and the Spanglers were involved with it. So this is definitely brick from Jefferson, and this was the house built by C.J. Millard about 1892 also, and he had bricklayers and carpenters from Jefferson, so I'm pretty sure that this also is brick from Jefferson. Well, that's pretty much my story. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. I've told you almost all I know. How did Brick Street get its name? Primarily because a majority of the houses built along that road were of brick. Not because of a brick road at all. And some of those brick houses you can still see along there. How many there were, I don't know. And this would have been in the 1880s pretty much, I think. I don't know the age of the Korth house. I read somewhere that Alexander Earl was the one who built that house, and I've never seen any deeds which show that he owned land there. I've seen Fargo's name, and I've seen Seaver's name, and I've seen a variety of. And I'm not disputing that Alexander Earl didn't build it, but except most of his building was over in the Astlin area. 1850s? Oh, well, if it did, then it would have to have been built by Seaver, because he owned it at that time. And again, if it was built in the 1850s, very likely it would have been brick which was brought over from Astlin. Again, as I've said, because brick weighed so much before we had railroads to move things like this, it just was too expensive to move, and it's pretty expensive otherwise. And they only got about 4 cents a brick. So, you know, you had to have a lot of brick before you could afford sending it very far. Any other questions? Carl? Question was, what's the difference between brick made with and without straw? And I know from the biblical references that the Hebrews were sometimes causing problems by not putting straw in it or something like this. I guess it makes it a stronger brick of some sort. As far as I know, brick nowadays does not have anything like that in it. It's ground up clay or shale. When you see some of the other brick houses around Lake Mills, which are, you know, from the 1900s and so forth, a great deal of these came from Milwaukee. There's one, and I can't remember which one. It was so-called rug brick, had a very rough surface on one side, and I can't remember which house that was. It could be the brick house which Harley Black used to have, which he built down on West Lake Street and just near North Ferry Drive.